Hi, Workplace Math 10 students. This is the 12th assignment and the last assignment before the test for your graphing unit. This is going to be the graphing test review. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So your assignment in Google Classroom should look like this. It's going to be called G12, Graphing Test Review. And once, what you'll need to do is just simply click on this Google form, and then you'll come to this Google form that looks like this. So in here, as it says, you're going to have 18 questions that are just going to be like almost identical to what you'll see on the graphing test. So please work through these, and then when you're finished and you've submitted them, please make sure you click on the view score to see how you did. And you can also read over the feedback, and it should give you some very clear indication as to why the answers were what they were. So basically, the first thing you need to do is you need to put in your name, and then you're going to need to work through these questions. So let's work on these one by one. So the very first question says here, what year was the population at its lowest? So basically what we have on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we have population, and on the x-axis we have the years. And the one in which the year is the lowest is right here. So that is 1995. And that is why we would want to click on here, and that answer would be 1995. So hopefully that makes sense. So let me just erase this off here. And let's take a look at the second question. So it says here, what was the range of the salmon population? And so basically, the salmon population here, we have, let me just click on here, scroll down a little bit further. So basically the salmon population, what we can see is that it ranges from a high of 95,000 right here. So that is the highest that it goes, and that was back in 2001, although that doesn't really matter to us. But that's the highest range. And then the lowest range is here, and that is, as it looks like, basically 15,000, so smack in the middle. So the range is defined as the difference between the highest and the lowest values. So if I were to look at my highest value, which is 95,000, and I were to look at my lowest value, which is 15,000, the difference between those two, when I plug it into the calculator, is going to be 80,000. So that would be my value there. And let's just plug that into the calculator just to make sure we understand where we got that number from. So I'll just switch to my calculator here. And basically what we have is we had the high number, which was 95,000, minus the lowest number we had, which was 15,000. And so the difference is 80,000, and that's where we get that figure from. So if I come back in here, that is why I would be clicking on that as the value. So question 3 says, during what time period was the car traveling the fastest? So this is basically, once again, a line graph, but this is a travel graph. And it's asking us, when was this traveling the fastest? Well, basically speed is basically time over, well, distance over time. And so basically when it was traveling the fastest, the speed is basically time, or sorry, distance over time. So it's distance over time. And the spot in which that we were traveling the fastest is the one in which we traveled the furthest in that time frame of, in this case, 15-minute intervals. So basically, right here, what I can see is that I traveled, it would look to me to be 19 kilometers in 15 minutes. And so we don't need to know the speed per se, we don't have to calculate that yet, but what we can see is that this is where I traveled further. I went from here to here, traveled further than in any other time frame. So the answer to this question here would be the 0 to 15 would be the correct answer. Hopefully that makes sense to you. just going to erase this off here. And then we'll look at the next question. So the next question is going to be very similar, but requiring a little bit more calculation. So in this case, it actually asks us not which one is the fastest, but what speed did we actually travel? Excuse me, from 15 to 30 minutes. So in this case, we are looking at this time frame from here to here. So basically from here to here, and then in 15 minutes. So if I look at this, this looks like I was at 8 kilometers here, and it looks like I was at 27 or so here. So 27 minus 8 is 19 kilometers. That's the difference between what I was at and what I'm here. So that's the distance I traveled. And remember that speed is, and if we're talking about kilometers per hour, well, we have traveled 19 kilometers. And now we didn't travel this in an hour, we traveled this in 15 minutes. And I'm just going to explain to you what that means. 15 minutes, if we remember, in 15 minutes, there is 60 minutes in an hour. So if we think about 15 minutes is actually 0.25 of an hour. So basically, 15 minutes is 0.25. We go 15 divided by 60 is 15 is 0.25 of an hour. So we have 19 over 0.25. And we're going to need to plug that into our calculator to figure this out. And so we'll come up with that answer. So let me just switch screens so we can go to our calculator here. So the very first thing I just want to do is just to clarify, if we were to take 15 minutes and divide it by 60, we can see that that's where we get the 0.25. So 15 minutes is a quarter, or 0.25 of an hour. And then we determined that basically we were at 26 minus 8 is the distance we traveled, which was 18 kilometers. And then we are going to divide that by 0.25. And so what we end up with is this 72 kilometers an hour is what we traveled. And so if I go back in here now, the answer here would be 72 kilometers an hour, and that would be the correct answer. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Question 5 is basically asking us to be able to interpret these bar charts. And so basically it's just asking us, it's saying, who has 2 more videos than Abby? Well, Abby is right here, and she has 2 videos. And 2 more than 2, so 2 added to 2 is 4. And so we're looking for the person who has 4 videos. And if I look along 4 here, the one that matches up with that is, oh, Martin. So therefore, Martin is the one that has 2 more videos than me. So I'm going to click on there, and that would be my answer for that. If that makes sense to you. And I will just erase this part out here, and we can move on to the next question. So this one here asks, who has 6 fewer pets than Tim? So in this case, it's very similar, but we're talking about 6 fewer. So Tim here is right here, and Tim has 7, because it's halfway between 6 and 8, so 7 pets. And so 6 less, so 7 minus the 6 less is going to be 1. And so we're looking for the person who has 1, and the one that lines up with 1 is Adele. So Adele is the one who has 6 fewer pets than Tim. And so I would click on Adele as my answer, and I'll do that. And that would be the answer for question 6. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Oh, I forgot to erase that off as well. So let's take a look at question 7. So this one is a little more complex, this type of question. So it says, calculate the amount of carbon dioxide, CO2, emitted to produce the energy for the last year to the nearest kilogram. Now, what we see here is that, first of all, it's talking about the last year. So we are talking about not this bill, but the same period last year. So this is what we're looking at. And what we see here is that it's 95 kilowatts that we have used last year at the same period. Now, what we also see here is it says the greenhouse gas emitted to produce the energy used in this bill, and so this bill is the 17 kilowatts, is producing 17.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So what we see is that what we get in kilograms of CO2, so this is 17.5 kilograms of CO2, carbon dioxide, is produced from basically every 17 kilowatts. So we have to figure out that at first. So when we do that, we are going to determine that this is basically almost one-to-one. It's almost one-to-one, but it's not exactly one-to-one. It's a little bit more than 1 kilogram for every kilowatt. But what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take that number that we get, and then we're going to have to multiply it by how many kilowatts we used in the period last year, which is 95. So when we plug this into our calculator, we will get the exact figure. So I'm going to just share screen now to my calculator, and so we can take a look at that. So basically what we have here is we firstly have to figure out the relationship between the carbon dioxide, which is 17.5 kilograms, over the 17 kilowatts that we use to produce that. So this is basically almost one, but it's a little bit more than 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide is produced for every kilowatt. We then multiply that by the 95 kilowatts that we used last year. And so this comes out with 97.79. And if we're going to round to the nearest kilogram, we would round up to 98 kilograms. And so that's why when we come back in here into this here, we would be choosing the 98 kilograms as our answer. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So let's take a look at another example here, another question. So in this case here, just going to move this down a little bit. It says calculate the percent convert in usage for this bill as a percentage of the last bill, round to 1 decimal place. So basically, it's saying calculate the percentage convert in usage for this bill, and this bill is right here. So this bill was 718, and as a percentage of last bill, which was 737. Okay, so basically what we're saying is calculate the percentage convert in usage. So we're looking at the difference. So we need to round to 1 decimal place. So essentially what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to take this, and we're going to have to take a look at the difference. So we have 737, which was the last bill, right? And we're going to have to take the difference of that, which is 718. And the difference between those two is 19. And then we're going to need to divide that by the last bill, which was 737, because we're comparing it to the last bill. And that's going to give us a value. And that value is going to be a decimal value. But that decimal value is going to need to be converted to a percentage by multiplying by 100. So we're going to have to take that number, we're going to have to multiply by 100 to figure out the actual percentage value. So let's plug this in the calculator and see what this looks like. So the first thing we have to do is we have to take the difference between last bill, which was 737, and the new bill, which was this bill, which was 718. So that's 19, we said. And then we're going to have to divide that by the last bill value, which is 737, and then we're going to need to multiply that by 100 to get it to be a percentage. So as we round to 1 decimal place with percentage, what we're going to see is 2.57 would round up to 2.6%. So the answer would be 2.6%, and that's why we would click on this value here as our answer. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So let's take a look at question 9. It says, how much did Susie earn from allowance? So we're looking at a pie chart here. And what we need to do is we need to understand that this pie chart is telling us that Susie earned $300, like the pie is representing $300 of total income. And that when we look at allowance, which is purple, so purple matches up with this, that the percentage for purple is 40%. So what I need to do is I need to take that 300 and I need to multiply by the decimal equivalent of 40%, which is 0.4. And once again, the decimal equivalent is of 40% is 0.4 because 40% divided by 100% is going to be equal to 0.4. And so when I take that number, 300 times 0.4, I should arrive at a value of $120, which is what the allowance portion represents. So let's take a look at that using a calculator, just see how we get that. So the very first thing we need to consider is, what is 40% again? It's 40 divided by the 100%, so it's the decimal equivalent is 0.4. We then need to multiply that 0.4 by the 300 total income we have to arrive at that $120 value. So that's why when we come back in here, we would be selecting this as our correct answer. Now, the next question here is asking once again about a pie chart, and it's saying here how many people prefer baseball. So this is the same idea here. In this case, baseball is represented by gray, and this gray is only 10%. But there are 400 people that were surveyed. So what we need to do is we need to multiply the 400 by the decimal equivalent of 10%, which is 0.1. And so when we do that, we're going to find out that the value here should be 40. And so let's just plug that into our calculator just to make sure that we can get that value. So once again, the total number of people surveyed was 400, and 10% of them, which is decimal equivalent of that is 0.1, responded they like baseball most, so that's 40 people. And that's why we would choose the answer of 40 here for this question. So let's take a look at this. Now this is looking at a pie chart and thinking about the percentage or the degrees that is represented by a particular shaded or unshaded portion. So it says here 70% of the circle is shaded blue in this case. Calculate the size of the angle formed at the center for the unshaded sector. So the key here is that we're looking at the unshaded. So what we want to know is we want to know the degree of this. We want to know the degree of this section here. Now, if we think about the fact that this is 70%, then what is left over out of the 100% of this total circle is that this must be 30%. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So 100% minus 30% or 70% equals 30%. Now, we need to consider the decimal equivalent of 30% is 0.3. And now we need to also remember that in any circle, there are 360 degrees. Hopefully you remember that. Doing a 360 is going once around in a full circle. So we're going to take that 360 and we're going to multiply it by the decimal portion that is the unshaded, which is 0.3. And when we do that, we should come out with an answer of 108 degrees. But we'll plug that into a calculator just to see, so you can see what this comes out to. So clicking on here again to get to the calculator, what we're going to do is, firstly, remember we had 70%, so we took 70% off of the full 100% to realize that that's 30%. 30% is what the unshaded sector was. And now if I divide that by 100, that is in fact 0.3. So it's 0.3 of the pie was unshaded. Now I need to multiply that by the 360 degrees that are in the full circle to figure out what the degrees are that were represented by this unshaded sector, which is 108 degrees. And that is why when we come back in here, we would select the value of 108 as our answer. So let's take a look at this. So this is the same type of question, question 12, except instead of having a percentage, we have a fraction. And so the first thing we have to remember here is that it's saying that 1/5 of the circle is shaded. So it's saying 1/5 is shaded. And so that means that the unshaded section is 4/5. Okay? So 4/5 is unshaded. And now what is 4/5 as a decimal? Well, if we take 4 and divide by 5, because that's what that line in the fraction means, we are going to get a value of 0.8. And now remember that 0.8 we can then multiply by the 360 degrees to arrive at our value. So we would just simply plug that into our calculator to get our value. So let's plug that in and see what it looks like. So if we go and shift to our calculator, once again, if we have 1/5 that is shaded, then the other 4/5 must be unshaded. So we're going to take 4 divided by the 5, and that tells me that 4/5 is a decimal equivalent of that is 0.8. I then need to multiply that by the 360 degrees that we have in a full circle, and that will give us the 288 degrees. So if I were to come back in here, what this is saying is that this is 288 degrees here, and that's why I would be clicking on that answer. Now, let's take a look at another sort of pie chart as well, or in athletics they call it sector graph. So in this one, it's a bit detailed, but basically it's asking us to, it says in a survey, students were asked what mode of transportation they used to come to school. The results of the response were as follows. 17 traveled by car, 8 traveled by bus, 11 traveled by train, and 4 walked to school. The results of the survey are partially shown in the pie chart below. Calculate the missing sector angle for the bus. So we want to know what the missing sector angle is for this bus. So right here is what we want to know. And so how do we figure that out? Well, first of all, we need to know what the total number of people were that were surveyed. So what I need to do is I need to take the 17 people that responded that they traveled by car, the 8 that said that they traveled by bus, and the 11 that said that they traveled by train, and the 4 that said they traveled to school by walking, and we add all those up. Now, obviously we can use a calculator for this, but if we quickly do this in our head, 17 plus 8 is 25, plus 11 would be 36, plus 4. So we total would be 40 people that we surveyed. Now what we're specifically focusing on here is the bus. So we see that 8 people traveled by bus. So 8 out of the 40 people said that they traveled by bus, or 8 out of 40. Another way of saying that is,
good morning, everyone. Allie came in this morning and made some chili buns, and there's some squares as well that are put out in one of the tables in the cafeteria. If you're hungry, you're certainly welcome to help yourself. Just remember the social distancing and stay 6 feet apart. But again, there's some chili buns and some squares in the cafeteria. You're welcome to help yourself. Thanks, Allie, for coming in and doing that for us. Appreciate it.
that was our beloved principal letting us know that there's some chili buns, which I'll have once I finish this up. So we're going to have to take, though, 8 divided by 40. That will give us a decimal equivalent, which is going to be basically 0.2. And I need to multiply that by the 360 degrees that are in a full circle. So looking at that using the calculator, what we would end up with here is we would end up with 8 divided by 40, which is the total number of people we surveyed. So that represents 0.2 of the people traveled by bus out of all the people surveyed, and we multiply that by 360 degrees, and so that gives us a value of 72 degrees. And that's why when we come back in here, we are going to choose this as the answer. So let's take a look now at some pictographs. These aren't particularly difficult, I don't believe, but let's take a look at how we would look at this one. It says, how many more fish does Carolyn have compared to Abigail? So Carolyn is right here, and she has 3 fish that are shown, but each of these fish really represent 10. So it's basically 3 times 10, so Carolyn has 30 fish. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Now, if we look at Abigail, Abigail has 2 full fish plus another half of that, but remember these are worth 10, so this is 2 times 10, and then this is another. That half is 5, so 2 times 10 is 20 plus 5 means that Abigail has 25 fish. So the difference between Carolyn and Abigail is 30 minus 25, so the difference here is 5. And hopefully that makes sense to you. I'll just plug that into the calculator just to kind of show you what we have here. So basically we have 3 times the 10 fish that represented are 30, and then we're going to subtract that by the 2 full fish plus the 1/2, so that's 25, makes 5 difference in the fish values. And so that's why the answer here would be 5. So now we are looking at tally charts here, and what it says here is which row in the tally chart contains data that is displayed incorrectly, indicated by the row by selecting the number of TV sets. So when we look at this, basically what we have is we have 0 is showing 7. Hopefully you can see that, 5 plus the extra 2. This is 1, this one is 4, this one is 6, and this one is 4. So let's just see which one of these is correct. Starting with 0, we should see 7 of these. So if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so that one's correct. So now I look at the 1. So I should only see 1. And oh, actually there's only 1. Yeah, so that one's correct. And now I should see 4, 2. So I see 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's it. So that one's correct. Now I look for 3s. So I should see 6 of these. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. But where are the rest? So that one is not correct. And we'll just finish up for 4 here just so we can see. But so 4 has 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that one's correct. So the one that is not correct in this case is the one that was represented with 3. And so I would scroll down, and the one that I'm going to choose then is the 3 one and say that that one wasn't correct. So I'm just going to stop share here and then come back just to clear off the screen easily. And so moving on to the next thing, what we are now looking at is we're looking at histograms. And so basically a histogram is a bar chart that represents some sort of frequency. And we'll see what we're saying here. It says, so how many runners are younger than 41? So what we see here is that we have, this is 41 to 50 and this is 51 to 60. So neither of these are what we're looking at, but we are looking at these other 3 groups right here. So these ones are all people that are under 41. So if I look at the first grouping, this lines up and it's showing me 5. This is showing me 9, and this is showing me 7. So basically, the amount of runners that are under 41 is the total of these 3 sections, 7, 9, and 5. So if I add those all up, and I try and kind of do that in my head, we're going to end up with 21. But we can switch to a calculator and just double check that. So basically what we're double checking here is the totals here, which is 7 plus 9 plus 5, which gets 21, and that's why that would be the correct answer. So if I come back in here, I would choose this as my correct answer. Now, this one here is very similar, but it's asking how many results are greater than 5. So basically this is 5, and so it needs to be greater than that, so this one doesn't work. But these 4 are all greater than 5, so we have to add all of these ones up. So if I look at how many people were 10, well, there was 9 of them. There were 6 people that were 15. There were 7 people that were 20, and there were 5 people that were 25. So if I add up all 4 of those numbers, 9 plus 6 plus 7 plus 5, then I'm going to end up with a value. 9 plus 6 is 15, plus 7 is 22, plus 5 is, excuse me, 27. But let's just plug that in our calculator just to make sure. So basically we have the value, so we have 9 plus 6 plus 7 plus 5, and that adds up to 27. So that's where we get that value from. And so I would answer this as 27. And then the last question, it's asking what is the range of the distribution. So once again, the range means the difference between the highest value and the lowest value. So the highest number here that we have of the scores is we have a score of 20. And we also have a score of 4. And so the difference between the score of 20 and the score of 4 is simply 16. We could plug that into our calculator, but I think most of us can probably do that in our head. And so the answer to that would be 16. So when we're finished all this, we can click submit, and then we should be able to see and view our score. And so it will tell us how we did. And looks like I actually did one wrong here. Let me just see here. 0 to 15. I'll have to check that one out because that one would actually be correct. Yeah, I'll have to look at that one. But carry on, give this a try, please. And yeah, we'll once you finish that, you'll get a mark out of 10. So if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to ask. And